now we have the privilege to hear from our last speaker at least on the panel, and then it's going to come to all of you. And we're going to hear from Yaman Kawamleh, who is a senior here at Valpo and works with Promise for Relief and Human Development, PRHD, a nonprofit, non-political, non-religious movement that focuses on constructive social change and community empowerment through education, healthcare, and basic economic development. PRHD's focus is primarily on assistance to those in need in Syria. And in addition to his work with this nonprofit, Yaman is also the project director for SALT's World Relief campaign this year. The campaign is entitled The Hope Underground and focuses on providing medical training for young Syrians interested in serving as medics to assist the wounded and ill in their local area. So, Yaman, we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
And thank everyone for coming, and thank you for the panelists for also being here. I'm honored to be here, actually, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. So to start off with my story, I'd actually have to start in the third aisle with my parents. That's my dad right there, and that's my mother. So my parents were born in Syria. My parents were born in Syria, and my dad grew up actually in a very impoverished household. He didn't have very much. And he dedicated everything he had to becoming a physician, because one day he wanted to give back. So he left Syria at a young age, and he sold all of his land and all the land his family gave him in Syria, which was a very big deal at the time, because that's everything he had to come here. He became a physician, and I was born in Chicago here, actually, and we moved around a lot. Now we're here in Northwest Indiana. And even though I was born here and raised here, I used to go back to Syria every single summer. And during those summers, my dad would open up our house to be a clinic, and anybody who wanted any kind of help would be more than welcome to come. And then my dad would ask for nothing and respond. And I used to love helping out my dad and assisting him during those times, because to me, that's how I learned to love, without any kind of boundary at all. It didn't matter where you're from, what their skin color was. My dad helped everyone regardless. And I started to love that. And I remember still to this day, 5 years ago, before the revolution in Syria started, I'd walk around late at night with my family members and my friends, and they would tell me about how lucky I was that I was American, that I could follow my dreams, that I was under no threat from the government, and I could speak freely. And they would tell me about how one day they dreamed of escaping to Europe or America one day themselves, so they could also do the same. My uncles and a lot of my family members were impoverished. They worked in factories, and they survived, but they weren't too well off. So in 2011, the Syrian revolution first started, and I remember before the revolution started, nobody thought it could happen because Syria was called the Kingdom of Silence. The dictatorship there was brutal. I remember even my parents were saying it would be impossible. Nobody was standing against the regime. But it started, and the regime actually responded with violence and backlash. And so what we did is me, along with my father and a lot of other doctors and other professionals around America, started Promise for Relief and Human Development, which is a non-political, non-religious organization to help provide both relief in the immediate, short-term relief for Syrians and the long-term. We want to rebuild Syrian civil society so that Syrian refugees can come back to Syria one day and live in a prospering country. So I took my first trip to Jordan to visit the refugee camps in 2012, and we raised money here. And I remember the moment that changed a lot of things for me is at that time my family was still in Syria, and their city was under bombardment, and it was bad, but they still hadn't been forced to flee. And we got to the refugee camp actually, and we thought my family was still in Syria. We were in Jordan, and we were taking pictures of the bathroom so we can show the conditions when we got back here to everyone. And we ran into my aunts and my uncles there. And it turns out a few days ago, my family's house had been destroyed and they had been forced to flee Syria. And they walked actually across the border. And we had no idea they were even there. So to me, that humanized things a lot to me. Because these people weren't just numbers anymore. They weren't refugees. They were people I knew. And they were people who had stories and they had dreams. And they were beautiful people. They loved me with all my heart going to Syria every single summer. And they never expected anything in return, even though I had so much back. So to me, all that was is these people weren't any less than any of my friends here. They weren't any less than me. They were equal. They just needed that opportunity. So for me, to all those loved ones, I've grown up just wanting to give the opportunity back, and that's come from my father. My faith has helped me tremendously throughout this whole entire process. Promise for Relief isn't a religious organization at all. We're actually secular, or we're not political, not religious. But for me, my faith personally helps me out a lot because I remember the first time I actually visited an orphanage in Jordan, and we brought with us about 150, 200 jackets at the time, and we thought that would be enough, but it wasn't enough. And I remember still to this day, a 6-year-old girl was tugging at my shoulder and she asked me for a jacket, and it wasn't even for herself. It was for her 2-year-old brother, who didn't have anything because their parents had died. And at that point, we were out of jackets, we were out of money, I had nothing, and I felt desperate. It was this feeling of desperation that was horrible. And I came back and I realized, like, what can I do about this? And for me, then one of my friends and my family reminded me that, you know what, you can only do what you can in this world, and the rest of it is up to God. So for me, when I do my humanitarian work, my faith keeps me going, because I know that I can't help everybody, and I can only do so much. I'm limited in my scope. But at the same time, having that faith that, you know what, God is always going to be there for me and others is what keeps me going, because I know God won't ever leave about anybody. The second way faith has really helped me out is because when people romanticize humanitarian relief a lot and humanitarian work, and I remember my first time traveling to Syria, I got no kind of training or anything, so I didn't know what to expect. And people aren't perfect. The refugees there, the people you're helping, they're just like us, they're just like me, and they're just like you. Where they're imperfect, sometimes they're going to be mad. They're not always going to be appreciative. Sometimes people will yell at you and they'll swear at you. And I learned at that point that when I go on these trips, I'm not just doing it for these people. I'm doing it for myself, to help better myself, to help them, and for the sake of God. So when you sit there and you have faith and you have that reason where, you know what, even if things aren't perfect, I'm doing this for the right reasons, for the sake of God or my religion, that's what keeps you found in humanitarian work, because you see a lot of horrible things, and it's hard to stay, sometimes it's hard to stay solid then. So my faith is what keeps me grounded during those times. My family actually fled Syria, most of them. They first fled to Jordan, where I visited them multiple times, as I just said. They had to pay 3 times the rent that any other Jordanian family would have to pay just because they were Syrian. They weren't allowed to work just because they were Syrian. And because of that, they fled again. And they first fled to Egypt, where the circumstances were a little bit better, but they still weren't perfect. And eventually they fled, and they went actually across on, I don't know if you guys have heard about them on the news, but there are these little makeshift boats that pretty much Egyptian gangs run, where you can travel across the Mediterranean Sea, and they get refugees to Europe. And they're extremely dangerous, and many of them sink, and thousands die. And I'll never forget the day my family fled Egypt on these boats, because they had no other hope of ever having any kind of future for their families and their children. And it was actually my mother's brothers, and they were gone for 5 days, and we didn't know if they would ever make it there. And I remember every single day my mom would call the Italian life coast, just asking, you know, did they make it, did they make it, have you gotten any Syrian refugees today? And on the 6th day, they finally made it, and they got to Italy, and eventually with the help of a lot of organizations, they got to Germany. And now they're living in Germany. And a few months ago, I talked to my uncles, and they were telling me about how we had our religious celebration there as Muslims, which was Eid. And they told me that their whole entire community got together, and they threw them an Eid celebration, and they introduced all of my family to the community, and they brought their children presents, and they were very welcoming. And to me, that was the most beautiful thing in the world, and I love that. So one of my goals here in America is we've already started accepting Syrian refugees. I believe we should accept more Syrian refugees, and I believe that we should become welcoming to Syrian refugees. I think we need to educate our communities, and I think we can make a difference like that, and that could make a large impact one day. As I mentioned, I work with Promise for Relief and Human Development. We're not as much focused on the refugee crisis now as we used to be. Now we're more focused on healthcare. We have orphan sponsorships, food assistance inside of Syria, where we want to rebuild Syrian civil society, and we want refugees to come back to Syria. And actually, we were just talking in our discussions when we were eating lunch about the difficulties of refugees coming to these countries. And sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Can you talk about the educational programs, Yaman?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, that's where I was going. I think I lost my train of thought.
Getting back on track.
Thank you. That's why you're there for me. So now we're not as much focused on the short-term relief, we're most focused on the long-term, and we were talking about how refugees didn't just lose necessarily the things around them, but they lost their culture, and they lost possibly the possibility of following their dreams. So we want them to have the opportunity to rebuild Syria by following their dreams, by regaining that stability. So one of the things we're doing is we're doing the project for SALT, which is spectacular, which is we're trying to train Syrians to become medical professionals within 2 years, so they could go back to the field hospitals and help take care of other Syrians. At this point, the field hospitals are really badly undermanned, because the Assad regime is specifically targeting medical workers. So because of that, most medical workers have fled. You have a civil war, and you have no medical workers, and it's a disaster. And for a while, Syrian American Medical Society and other organizations I worked with would send people from here to go work in Syria. And it was very costly and it wasn't efficient. So our idea is, hey, let's give them an opportunity to follow their education, follow their dreams, and rebuild Syria themselves one day. Because humanitarian work, as we all know here, isn't saving anybody, it's just empowering. It's helping others have that same opportunity that we have. Thank you.
you've made a global refugee crisis very real for us, the sense of loss, but also the hope that comes in its midst, and thank you for that. That's quite a gift to be able to share with us.